Dear anti-Zionist Jews, it has taken me a year to write this letter to you, a year of agonizing over what to say, a year of not finding the words. I needed to write to clear my head and clarify my thoughts. Maybe it will also open a dialogue between us. I hope it will. With so much dividing us these days, we also share an overriding commonality. We are Jews, which means we are family. Just 15.8 million, a sliver of humanity. No matter how sharply we may disagree, we cannot disown each other. We Jews need to stick together. Family should not demonize their own. You have been maligned, and you feel misunderstood. You are wondering where you fit within the Jewish community these days. The Haggadah speaks of a child called Rasha. Usually translated wicked, the Rasha in fact refers to one who chooses to stand outside the Jewish community asking, what does this ceremony mean to you? The Rasha challenges accepted Jewish norms. The Haggadah goes on to rebuke the Rasha's perspective, but never excommunicates that child from the community. We share a common language of Jewish values. You've expressed that your anti-Zionism emerges from your understanding of tikkun olam, the directive to repair a broken world. You've reminded us that Judaism abhors the shedding of blood. Images of broken bodies and broken families and broken buildings clash with Judaism's emphasis on love of neighbor and compassion for the vulnerable. You insist never again is a universal imperative, one that applies not only to the Jews. This is very Jewish. You also assert that Judaism can thrive without Zionism, that Jews do not need a state of our own, that diaspora gives us everything we need. It is easy to make that statement from the relative comfort and safety of America. The half of our family that lives in Israel, about 7.5 million of us, the vast majority descended from refugees whose only hope could be found in the Jewish state, begs to differ. We are Jews, each deserving a place at the family table of the Jewish people. And at the same time, I feel terrible angst about anti-Zionism entering the Jewish mainstream. In order to help you understand why, here's my story. It begins well before most students on college campuses today were born, almost 30 years ago, when I first set foot in Israel in June of 1995. All Reformed Jewish clergy, including my colleagues who've shared the bema this morning, spend a year immersing ourselves in the culture, language, history, and land of Israel. I arrived believing, like many at the time, that peace between Israelis and Palestinians was around the corner. 2 years earlier, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook hands with PLO leader Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn, with President Bill Clinton between them, nudging them closer than either preferred. What made this possible was something called the Oslo process, a series of bilateral negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians designed to achieve peace and pave the way for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. This was neither fantasy nor love fest. It may seem hard to believe today, but at the time, a majority of Israelis, Palestinians, and Jewish Americans supported the peace process. A two-state solution had emerged as the only just conclusion to decades of hatred, mistrust, and violence. It was never intended to inaugurate a warm and loving marriage, but rather to effectuate a divorce, if you will, ending a resentful entanglement between estranged partners who nevertheless had concluded that both had legitimate claims to the same small strip of land. As Rabbi memorably wrote after that fateful handshake, we don't make peace with friends, we make it with enemies. That Palestinians and Israelis remained enemies even throughout the Oslo process became apparent as I got ready to go to Israel. Jewish extremists and Islamic fundamentalists used horrifying violence to sow panic and mistrust. At the time, mass shootings and suicide bombings were not the stuff of everyday headlines. These were game-changing attacks carried out by fanatical Zionists and fanatical anti-Zionists, who ironically shared a common goal: disrupt and destroy the peace process by any means possible. Apocalyptic religious visions seduced extremists on both sides to choose hate over love, war over peace, conquest over compromise. And yet, as I arrived in Israel in the summer of 1995, the peace process moved forward, hobbled, but not incapacitated. Saturday night, November 4th, I had returned to my apartment in Jerusalem after an evening spent playing trivia games and drinking beer with some friends when the phone rang. A classmate. "Turn on the radio," she said. "Rabin's been shot." We had classmates at the peace rally in Tel Aviv where the prime minister had been speaking to a crowd more than 100,000 strong. Rabin himself had expressed astonishment at how many Israelis had shown up to support peace with the Palestinians. Israel's most idealistic youth turned out in force. People, it seems to me, a lot like you. Jews determined not to accept the status quo, willing to be the Rasha at the Seder table. Jews, mostly young, who recognized in Israel's Palestinian neighbors the faces of suffering human beings. Jews who detested the fact that more than a quarter century after the Six-Day War, the West Bank and Gaza still remained under Israeli control, this being 10 years before Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, with Palestinian mobility, freedom, dignity, and aspirations thwarted. Jews full of passion and compassion. Again, I think a lot like you. In 1995, unlike today, it was not unusual to identify as both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian, wanting the same thing for both, a safe home to call their own. And that's why those idealistic youth showed up at that electric November night, jumping with their pro-peace banners into the plaza's fountains with unbridled joy, while rabbins sang along to Shir LaShalom, the beloved song for peace, as the rally was wrapping up. At that moment, a 25-year-old Jewish law student and religious extremist named Yigal Amir quietly stepped out of the crowd and put 2 bullets in the back of the prime minister at near point-blank range. Rabin was declared dead an hour and a half later. In hindsight, many of our hopes and dreams died that night as well. If you had been there, I believe yours would have too. The next day, numb with shock and grief, I found myself standing in line with hundreds of thousands of Israelis to honor our fallen hero. I shuffled by his casket as it lay in state on the plaza of the Knesset. I watched his funeral procession from my apartment balcony and could pick out President Clinton's motorcade. I remember Rabin's family members stumbling through the words of the mourner's Kaddish. But the image I will never shake is of a silent man sitting cross-legged in Jerusalem's Zion Square, a sign around his neck with one Hebrew word written in blood-red paint: busha, shame. The rest of my year in Israel went by like a restless night, all of us trying to keep things as normal as possible. Field trips to explore Israelite archaeology, biblical grammar quizzes, tutoring a 12-year-old Jewish Ethiopian immigrant boy whose Hebrew was as rudimentary as mine, singing Reform Jewish camp songs with my classmates Friday mornings before Shabbat on Ben Yehuda Street, Jerusalem's pedestrian mall, navigating the sensory assault of the shuk, the outdoor market, figuring out how to argue like an Israeli when someone cut me off in a supermarket checkout line, or when the laundromat lost every other sock, only to be rebuffed, "You Americans don't understand the pressure we Israelis live with every day." On February 25th and March 3rd, 1996, Loud explosions startled me from a sound sleep. Within 2 miles of my apartment, Hamas suicide bombers had carried out twin bombings on Jerusalem public buses, 1 week apart, murdering 45 people. A rash of similar attacks followed in swift succession, every couple of weeks or so, throughout the winter and spring, on buses, residential streets, near the popular Dizengoff Center in Tel Aviv. The victims included a number of young American students. I have to be honest, I was scared, sad, angry, and so very homesick. But we rode out the rest of the year in an uneasy mixture of dread and hope, bound by the commitment that as Jewish leaders in formation, we were all in this together. None of us left Israel. Most of us stopped riding the buses. Many of us leaned into activism, animated by a belief, however naive it may seem today, that the voices of moderation would prevail, that the momentum toward a just solution to the conflict would override the voices of religious extremism and uncompromising nationalism, ideologies that make no room for the other, that view the world in binaries, black and white, good and evil, my team or no team. The school year ended. Following Rabin's assassination, Israeli society had fractured over the best way forward. Rabin's heir apparent, veteran statesman Shimon Peres, pledged to revive the peace process and proceed with Oslo. His opponent, a charismatic 47-year-old, promised to be tough on terrorism and hard-nosed with Arafat. Until the day of the election, it looked like it could go either way. On May 31st, 1996, the day I arrived back in the US, Benjamin Netanyahu was elected Israel's next prime minister. There is so much more I could tell you about the last 30 years. As my Zionism has grown and deepened, so has my appreciation for the complexity with which Israelis live. How for them, the world's only Jewish state holds the keys to their past, present, and future. How they will willingly lay down their lives and send their children into harm's way to protect the only place in the world that ever protected them and their families, when the rest of the world showed them the door, forced their conversion, stole their property, and murdered them. How, when their government fails them, they take to the streets to demand better. How, when the global Jewish community fails them, they feel grievously betrayed, because it is their own family turning their backs on them. I have also seen, these 30 years, how the status quo has continued to fail the Palestinians. I have been to the border of Gaza and inside the West Bank many times. I have been to the checkpoints, where Palestinian laborers idle in interminable lines carrying their lunches in see-through plastic bags so as not to arouse suspicion, subjected at times to humiliating inspections, all in order to earn a living wage, because after all, the best-paying jobs are to be found in Israel, not the territories. I have seen peace offers come and go, some more promising than others, the best of them rejected by Palestinian leadership, opportunities to re-engage ignored by hardline Israeli governments, who apparently have little regard for what Rabin said about making peace with your enemies, not your friends. I have seen years of terror and years of quiet enough at times to lull us into a false sense of security that the conflict had just evaporated, a complacency shattered on October 7th. Since my year in Jerusalem, a whole new generation of Israelis and Palestinians has grown up behind fences and walls erected to save Israeli lives, which, thank God, they have and still do. But a byproduct of these barriers is that for 20 years, Palestinians and Israelis have inhabited separate and dissimilar realities, growing up with their own mythologies and prejudices about the other, untempered by human interaction. Israel has become an economic and technological powerhouse. Palestinians have languished in squalor, victims at least as much of their own autocratic, cynical, and feckless leaders as they are of Israeli repression. and Hamas persists, unwavering to the end in its jihadist ideology, unbending in its determination to, quote, liberate Islamic lands from the Jew. You rightly point to the ugly inequality of Jews and Palestinians living in the West Bank. Just know that when Hamas talks about ending the occupation, they don't mean IDF-controlled West Bank highways, enclaves, and checkpoints. They don't mean unchecked Jewish settler violence or encroachment on Palestinian farms and olive groves. They don't even mean the blockade of Gaza's borders, which Israel administers jointly with Egypt. No, for Hamas, Tel Aviv is occupied. Haifa is occupied. Eilat is occupied. Hamas, like its ideological confederates in Hezbollah, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic Republic in Iran, the Houthis, and like-minded movements across the globe, envisions a world that is Judenrein, the word the Nazis used to mean purged of Jews. Theirs is a zero-sum game. One cannot understand October 7th or what has followed without first understanding that Hamas has spent the last 17 years putting every last dollar that could have been used to care for the people of Gaza into building a vast apparatus for asymmetrical warfare, training tens of thousands of fighters in land, air, sea, and cyber combat, building a massive impenetrable fortress beneath Gaza, using its civilians as human shields, and all the while brainwashing Gaza's children to become martyrs devoted to the cause of eliminating Israel. I don't blame you for not understanding this. It is incomprehensible that a people can be so filled with hate, so committed to another people's utter destruction, so callous about human life, in fact, not seeing Jewish lives, that is, our lives, yours and mine, as human at all. This is difficult for our Western liberal sensibilities to comprehend. The savagery of October 7th, the butchery, the torture, the rapes, the kidnappings, the grotesque glee expressed by perpetrator and spectator alike. These are not incidental to Hamas's aims. They are part and parcel of a decades-long program to render coexistence with the Jewish state and with Jews impossible. And truth be told, the Israeli enemies of peace, whose malign intentions became crystal clear following the Rabbi murder, have not gone away either. And a number of them now exercise outsized influence on Israel's political agenda, fomenting bitter infighting in Israeli society, some from their seats in the Knesset. You are not wrong to protest the suffering of the Palestinian people. You are not wrong to protest the Israeli government or the way it prosecutes war. Critiquing Israel does not make one a Jewish traitor. Israelis themselves are quite good at it. Israeli democracy tolerates an extraordinary degree of dissent, and it could be argued that argument is their national pastime. But I write this letter to you to implore you to manifest your compassion for the Palestinian people in ways that do not erase the reality of the other half of your Jewish family. For every one of us, remember that another Jew is marking Rosh Hashanah in Israel today. That person is your twin, your mirror image. Back in 2007, the year Hamas violently seized power in Gaza, my rabbi, Jan Katsu, wrote words that resonate with even greater force today. We live in an either-or world, he observed. Either you are with us or against us. Either you are right or you are wrong. Either you are good or you are evil. Either you win or you lose. It may be simple to live in an either-or world. An either-or world is inhabited by two types of people, friends or enemies, citizens or barbarians, members or infidels, brothers or others, people who have the truth and people who do not. In extreme cases, an either-or world is divided between people I would die for and people I would kill, people of God and people without God. We are all witnesses to an either-or world, but we do not have to accept it and live according to its norms. Judaism offers a different precept, known in the Talmud as elu va'elu. The phrase comes from a famous debate between the rival teachers Hillel and Shammai, which had become so intractable that it had to be resolved by a divine proclamation. Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim, which means these and those opinions are both the words of the living God, even though the law follows Hillel. Our tradition rejects either or, it embraces both and. The enemies of shalom live in an either-or world. They say, you must choose. You cannot be both a Zionist and a champion of equality and justice for all God's children. They say that this little strip of land is big enough for only one people, mine or yours, not both. Elu va'elu. There's another way. You can critique Israel without making common cause with those who seek Israel's destruction. You can support Palestinian lives without denying Israeli lives. You can be a Zionist without being a messianic triumphalist. Elu va'elu. We need to accept once and for all that there is no reasonable or just outcome to this awful conflict where one nation emerges victorious and the other vanishes into thin air, or where one lives forever hunted and haunted by the other. Elu va'elu, both must live. And that can happen only when Palestinians turn from a vision of Israel's destruction and choose to build a future alongside the sovereign state of the Jewish people. It can happen only when Jewish religious and national extremism and anti-Arab racism are seen as betrayals of our values and dead ends for Israel's future. It can happen only when the champions of both and prevail over the patrons of either or. And so, I close my letter to you with a plea. Come out of the makeshift tents on campus. Come back to the big tent of Jewish communal life. Stop canceling speakers who affirm Israel's right to exist, and instead start engaging in dialogue and debate. Please get off social media and participate in face-to-face conversation. Step away from the fringes, the easy comfort of slogans and moral certitude. Come rejoin the messy middle, this place with no easy answers, but where compromise and connection are, God willing, still possible. It's the first day of a new year, and our family table has a place set for you. I remain yours, a proud, pained, and ever hopeful Zionist. Shana Tova.